May 7, 1942. 0400 hours. Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Squadron Leader John Jackson stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his ground crew attach what looked like children's wagon wheels to the wingtips of his P-40 Kittyhawk fighter. The modification was absurd. It violated every principle of aerodynamic design that Jackson had learned at the Royal Australian Air Force Academy. The wheels jutted out from each wingtip like tumours, adding drag, disrupting airflow, making the aircraft look like a broken toy cobbled together by someone who had never seen a real airplane. Yet every pilot in 75 Squadron was having the same modification installed on their fighters this morning. Orders from Wing Commander Peter Jeffrey. The wheels had been salvaged from crashed Japanese bombers, cut down, reinforced with scrap metal from the base workshop. They weighed approximately 8 pounds each. They extended roughly 6 inches beyond the wingtip. They were painted the same drab olive as the rest of the aircraft in a half-hearted attempt to make them less conspicuous. It did not work. The modified fighters looked ridiculous. Jackson was 24 years old. He had been flying combat missions over New Guinea for 3 months. He had shot down 2 Japanese aircraft, probably destroyed a third. He was a competent pilot, not exceptional, but reliable. His ground crew chief, Sergeant Bill Morrison, finished securing the second wheel and stepped back. Morrison was 41, too old for flight duty, assigned to ground maintenance because he had worked as an automotive mechanic in Sydney before the war. Morrison looked at the modified Kittyhawk and shook his head. He told Jackson it was the stupidest thing he had seen since joining the service. Jackson agreed completely. But Wing Commander Jeffrey had been insistent during the briefing the previous evening. Every operational aircraft would have wheels attached to wingtips before dawn. No exceptions, no debates. Just install them and be ready to fly. Jeffrey had explained his reasoning, though reasoning seemed too generous a term for what was obviously desperation masquerading as tactics. Port Moresby was running out of pilots faster than it was running out of aircraft. The Japanese were attacking almost daily with bomber formations escorted by Zero fighters. Australian and American squadrons based at Port Moresby were outnumbered, outranged, and losing aircraft at unsustainable rates, not primarily to combat damage, though that was bad enough. They were losing aircraft to what the pilots called tip strikes. Wing Commander Jeffrey had lost 4 pilots in the previous 2 weeks, not to Japanese guns but to their own aggressive tactics. The Kittyhawk was inferior to the Japanese Zero in almost every performance category that mattered in aerial combat. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, could climb higher, and could turn inside the Kittyhawk's turning radius. Japanese pilots were experienced veterans who had been fighting in China since 1937. They knew their aircraft's capabilities intimately. Australian pilots in New Guinea were mostly recent graduates, with minimal combat experience flying an aircraft that was already obsolete by 1942 standards. The tactical situation was hopeless through conventional fighter tactics, so Jeffrey had forbidden conventional tactics. He had ordered his pilots to stop trying to dogfight Zeros, stop trying to outturn them, stop trying to climb with them. Instead, use the one advantage the Kittyhawk possessed: diving speed. The Kittyhawk was heavier than the Zero, built more solidly, equipped with a more powerful engine. In a straight dive, the Kittyhawk was faster. Jeffrey's tactic was simple: attack from above. Dive through the bomber formation, fire on the dive, keep diving, do not turn, do not climb, do not engage the Zeros. Just dive away, escape at ground level, return to base. It was effective when pilots followed orders. Unfortunately, combat instincts and years of training made it nearly impossible to dive toward the ground and keep diving, when every pilot instinct screamed to pull up, to turn, to fight. Pilots would dive through the bombers, then instinctively pull up to assess damage or engage pursuing Zeros. That pull-up at low altitude after a high-speed dive was killing them. The Kittyhawk's wingspan was 37 feet 2 inches. At high speed in a tight pull-up, the wingtips experienced tremendous stress. If a pilot pulled too hard, too fast, too low, the wingtip could strike the ground before the aircraft leveled out. At 400 miles per hour, a wingtip touching dirt meant instant cartwheel, instant fireball, Instant death. 4 pilots dead in 2 weeks. Not shot down, not killed by enemy action. Just dead because they pulled up too aggressively after successful attacks. Wing Commander Jeffrey needed to stop the tip strikes without telling his pilots to stop attacking aggressively. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The solution Jeffrey had devised made no aerodynamic sense, but it made psychological sense. Attach wheels to the wingtips. Not landing gear, just small wheels that would drag on the ground during a low pull-up and warn the pilot he was too low. If the wheel hit dirt and kicked up dust, the pilot would see it, feel it, and shove the nose back down before the wingtip structure itself made contact. The wheel would sacrifice itself. The aircraft and pilot would survive. Maybe. Jeffrey's theory assumed several things. First, that the added drag from the wheels would not reduce the Kittyhawk's already marginal performance enough to make it completely ineffective. Second, that pilots would actually notice when the wheels struck ground during high-speed combat maneuvers. Third, that they would react correctly by pushing the nose down rather than panicking and pulling harder. Fourth, that the wheels would break away cleanly when they struck ground instead of catching and flipping the aircraft anyway. None of these assumptions had been tested. There had been no time for testing. Jeffrey needed operational aircraft in the air by dawn because Japanese reconnaissance had been observed the previous afternoon. That meant bombers were coming, probably today, possibly this morning. Jackson climbed into his Kittyhawk's cockpit at 05:15. The pre-flight checks showed everything normal, except for the slight asymmetric drag from the wingtip wheels. He could feel it during the control surface check. The aircraft wanted to pull slightly right during aileron deflection. Morrison had done his best to balance the installation, but 8 pounds on each wingtip was not negligible. Jackson started the engine. The Allison 12-cylinder engine coughed, caught, settled into its characteristic rough idle. Around him, 11 other Kittyhawks were starting their engines. 75 squadrons full operational strength, 12 aircraft, 12 pilots, against whatever the Japanese sent. American intelligence estimated the Japanese had approximately 100 operational aircraft based at Rabaul. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes. Not all would strike Port Moresby on any given day, but the Japanese routinely sent formations of 20 to 30 bombers escorted by 15 to 20 Zero fighters. The mathematics were unfavorable. 12 Australian fighters against 30 to 50 Japanese aircraft. The Australians would be outnumbered at least 3 to 1, possibly 4 to 1. The only advantage was that the Japanese had to fly 250 miles from Rabaul to Port Moresby, which gave the Australians time to climb to altitude before the enemy arrived. Not much time, but some. At 05:45, the radar station at Port Moresby detected incoming aircraft. Range 120 miles, bearing north-northeast, altitude unknown, multiple contacts. Large formation. Wing Commander Jeffrey gave the order to scramble. Jackson advanced the throttle and rolled onto the runway. The Kittyhawk accelerated slowly. The added weight and drag from the wingtip wheels were noticeable. Normal takeoff speed was approximately 105 miles per hour. Jackson rotated at 110 and felt the aircraft mush slightly before climbing away. The wheels were costing him performance, no question. How much remained to be seen. The squadron formed up over the airfield and began climbing northwest toward the expected intercept point. Standard procedure was to climb to 20,000 feet, position themselves between the sun and the incoming bombers, wait for visual contact, then attack. At 06:20, one of the other pilots radioed contact, bombers at 12 o'clock high, altitude approximately 19,000 feet. Jackson looked up and saw them. A formation of twin-engine bombers, flying in tight V formations. He counted 24 bombers, Mitsubishi G-4Ms, called Bettys by the Allies. Each Betty carried 1 ton of bombs and had defensive armament of 4 20mm cannons and 3 7.7mm machine guns. Above and around the bombers, Jackson could see the Zeros. Small, nimble, dangerous. He counted at least 18. probably more that he could not see. Wing Commander Jeffrey's voice came over the radio. Attack order. Ignore the fighters, target the bombers, dive through, do not turn back. Jackson pushed the throttle forward and nosed over into the attack dive. The Kittyhawk accelerated quickly. The altimeter unwound. 20,000 feet, 19,000, 18,000. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour. The bombers grew larger in his gun sight. He selected the rightmost bomber in the lead V formation. At approximately 1,000 yards, he opened fire. The Kittyhawk's 650 caliber machine guns hammered. 3 guns in each wing, total rate of fire approximately 40 rounds per second. The convergence point was set at 300 yards. Jackson walked his fire into the bomber's right engine. He saw strikes, saw smoke, kept firing until the range collapsed to less than 200 yards. Then he dove under the bomber and kept diving. The instinct to pull up was overwhelming. He had just put rounds into an enemy aircraft. He wanted to see if it was going down. He wanted to check for zeros on his tail. He wanted to climb back to altitude and engage again. Instead, he kept the nose down and dove toward the jungle below. The airspeed indicator touched 400 miles per hour. The Kittyhawk was shaking. The control stick felt heavy. At 5,000 feet, Jackson began his pull-up. He eased the stick back gradually, feeling the G-force build. 4,000 feet. The jungle was rushing up fast. 3,000 feet. He pulled harder. The G-force increased. His vision began to grey at the edges. 2,000 feet. Pull harder. The aircraft was leveling out, but slowly. Too slowly. 1,000 feet. He could see individual trees. 500 feet. He shoved the stick forward slightly, reducing the pull, accepting that he would level out lower than intended. Then he felt it. A thump. A vibration. A scraping sound. His right wingtip wheel had touched the jungle canopy. Jackson's reaction was instantaneous. He pushed the stick forward aggressively, dove back toward the trees, then pulled up more gently at 300 feet above the ground. The wheel had saved him. Without it, his wingtip would have struck the canopy at 400 miles per hour. The aircraft would have cartwheeled. He would be dead. Instead, he was alive, flying level at low altitude, still over enemy-held territory, needing to get back to Port Moresby. He checked his 6 o'clock. Clear. No, zeros had followed him down. They were still with the bombers, protecting the formation from the other Australian fighters still attacking. Jackson stayed low, followed the coastline south, kept his speed up. Behind him, the air battle continued. He could hear radio calls. Pilots calling out targets, confirming kills, warning about zeros. Someone reported 2 bombers smoking and losing altitude. Someone else reported a zero on his tail and was trying to evade. The radio went silent for that pilot. No one called him again. Jackson landed at Port Moresby at 06:55. Ground crew swarmed his aircraft. Morrison climbed up and examined the right wingtip wheel. It was battered, scored, half the rubber stripped away, but it was still attached. Morrison looked at Jackson and grinned. He said the stupid wheel had worked. Over the next 40 minutes, the rest of 75 Squadron returned. 9 aircraft landed. 3 pilots did not return. 1 was later confirmed killed when his aircraft was shot down by a zero. 2 others were listed as missing, their fates unknown. But no one had died from a tip strike. The wing commander's absurd modification had worked. The pilots who survived all reported similar experiences. They had dove through the bomber formation, attacked, dove away, and during the pull-up at low altitude, they had felt their wingtip wheels brush the ground or the jungle canopy. Each time, the sensation had caused them to push the nose back down and level out at a safer altitude. The wheels were functioning exactly as Jeffrey had intended, not as aerodynamic improvements, but as warning devices. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. During the afternoon briefing, Wing Commander Jeffrey announced that the wheels would remain standard equipment on all 75 Squadron aircraft until further notice. The pilots grumbled about the added drag and reduced performance, but no one argued seriously. The wheels had saved at least 3 lives that morning, possibly more. The tactical results from the morning's engagement were assessed as moderately successful. 2 Japanese bombers confirmed, destroyed. 4 more reported as damaged and possibly destroyed, pending confirmation from coast watchers. 1-0 probably destroyed. Australian losses were 3 aircraft and 3 pilots. The exchange ratio favoured the Japanese, but Port Moresby was still operational. The airfield had not been bombed. The fuel dumps were intact. The war continued. What happened over the following weeks would validate Jeffrey's modification in ways no one anticipated. The wingtip wheels, initially installed to prevent tip strikes during pull-ups, began affecting Australian tactics in unexpected ways. Pilots discovered they could fly lower and more aggressively because they had a physical warning system. If the wheel touched ground, push the nose down. Simple, effective, reliable. This changed how 75 Squadron engaged Japanese formations. Instead of diving through and immediately escaping at altitude, pilots began diving through, leveling out at extremely low altitude, 50 to 100 feet above the ground or jungle canopy, then racing away at maximum speed. The Japanese Zeros could not follow. The Zero was an exceptional aircraft at altitude, but at extremely low level, its lightweight and long wingspan made it unstable. Japanese pilots were trained for high-altitude combat where the Zero's maneuverability dominated. They were not trained for treetop-level flight at 400 miles per hour. Australian pilots, protected by their wingtip wheels, became comfortable operating at altitudes that would have been suicidal without the warning system. On May 19, 1942, 75 Squadron intercepted a formation of 18 Betty bombers, escorted by 12 Zeros. The Australian pilots executed their standard dive attack, but this time they did something different. After diving through the bomber formation, they levelled out at less than 100 feet and flew parallel to the bomber formation for approximately 30 seconds, below the bombers' defensive guns' depression angle, while firing upward into the bombers' bellies. The bombers' defensive armament could not depress enough to fire at targets directly below. The Zeros could not dive to intercept without risking overshooting and crashing into the jungle. For 30 seconds, the Australian fighters had free shots at the bomber formation's most vulnerable area. 4 bombers went down in flames, 2 more were severely damaged and crashed before reaching Rabaul. The Australians lost 1 aircraft when a pilot misjudged his altitude and his wingtip wheel caught on a tree. The wheel broke away as designed, but the aircraft tumbled anyway. The pilot did not survive, but the tactic worked. Flying underneath the bomber formations at extreme low altitude, protected by the wingtip wheels, gave the Australians a tactical advantage that partially offset the Zero's superiority in turning combat. Wing Commander Jeffrey refined the tactic over subsequent engagements. He ordered pilots to dive through the formation, level out low, parallel the bombers for 1 high-speed firing pass, then escape at low altitude. No turning back, no climbing to re-engage. Just 1 pass and away. The Japanese adapted slowly. They began flying their bomber formations at lower altitudes to reduce the vertical separation from the jungle, which made it harder for Australian fighters to fly underneath. They stationed Zeros at lower altitudes, specifically to intercept Australian fighters during the escape phase. But the fundamental problem remained. The Zero could not safely operate at the altitudes where Australian pilots, protected by their wingtip wheels, were now comfortable fighting. By mid-June 1942, 75 Squadron had developed a reputation among Japanese bomber crews as particularly dangerous. Intelligence reports captured later in the war showed that Japanese pilots called them the ground devils because of their willingness to fight at suicidally low altitudes. Between May 7th and July 15th, 1942, 75 Squadron flew approximately 120 combat sorties against Japanese bomber formations attacking Port Moresby. During this period, the squadron claimed 32 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed, primarily bombers, with an additional 18 listed as probably destroyed. Australian losses during the same period were 14 aircraft and 11 pilots. 7 pilots had been shot down by enemy fire. 4 had been killed in accidents, including the one tip strike despite the wingtip wheels. 3 pilots had been forced to bail out over friendly territory and return to duty. The exchange ratio heavily favoured the Australians, primarily because the wingtip wheel modification allowed tactics that would otherwise have been impossible. By August 1942, the tactical situation over New Guinea was changing. American forces were increasing their presence. New fighter types, including P-38 Lightnings with better performance than the Kittyhawk, were arriving. The Japanese were withdrawing air assets to support operations in the Solomon Islands. The intensity of air combat over Port Moresby decreased. Wing Commander Jeffrey was promoted and transferred to command a training unit in Australia. His replacement, Squadron Leader Peter Turnbull, reviewed the wingtip wheel modification and made a decision. Remove them. The wheels had served their purpose. Pilots were now experienced enough to judge their altitude without physical warning devices. The added drag was reducing combat effectiveness. New replacement aircraft arriving from the United States did not have the modification, and retrofitting them seemed pointless. By September 1942, all 75 squadron aircraft had their wingtip wheels removed. The modification had lasted exactly 4 months. No other Allied squadron adopted the wingtip wheel modification. The official Royal Australian Air Force history of the New Guinea campaign mentioned it in a single footnote, describing it as an improvised solution to a specific tactical problem. American fighter squadrons fighting in the Pacific never used wingtip wheels. Neither did British squadrons in Burma or European squadrons fighting in North Africa. The modification was unique to 75 Squadron during a 4-month period when they were desperately outnumbered and losing pilots to tip strikes at an unsustainable rate. After the war, several historians interviewed surviving pilots from 75 Squadron. Squadron Leader John Jackson, who had survived the war with 6 confirmed kills, was asked about the wingtip wheels in a 1978 interview. Jackson said the wheels had looked absolutely stupid. Every pilot in the squadron had complained about them. The added drag reduced their already marginal performance against the superior Japanese Zeros. But Jackson admitted the wheels had probably saved his life at least twice, and had definitely saved other pilots' lives multiple times. He said the modification was the kind of desperate improvisation that only makes sense when you are losing and need to try something, anything, that might keep pilots alive long enough to learn how to fight effectively. Wing Commander Peter Jeffrey, who had ordered the modification, was asked about it during a post-war interview in 1953. Jeffrey explained that the idea had come from watching a farmer in northern Queensland. Before the war, Jeffrey had been stationed at Townsville. One weekend, he had driven into the countryside and stopped to watch a farmer ploughing a field with a tractor. The tractor had small wheels attached to the plough assembly that dragged along the ground. The farmer explained they were guide wheels. If the plough dug too deep, the wheels would rise up and alert the farmer to adjust the depth. Simple mechanical feedback. Jeffrey had filed that observation away. When he faced the crisis of pilots dying from tip strikes at Port Moresby, he remembered the farmer's plough. If guide wheels could warn a farmer that his plough was too deep, maybe guide wheels could warn a pilot that his aircraft was too low. The analogy was imperfect. The engineering was questionable. The execution was hasty. But it worked. Jeffrey said the wingtip wheels probably shot down more Japanese aircraft than any single tactical innovation he implemented during the war. Not because the wheels themselves shot down aircraft, but because they enabled tactics that kept Australian pilots alive long enough to become effective and allowed them to fight in ways that exploited the Kittyhawk's few advantages while minimizing its many disadvantages. The 32 Japanese bombers claimed as destroyed by 75 Squadron between May and July 1942 represented approximately 15% of Japanese bomber losses over New Guinea during that period. Those losses forced the Japanese to reduce the frequency of raids against Port Moresby and divert air assets to protect the bombers more heavily. That reduction in bombing allowed Australian and American ground forces to build up supplies at Port Moresby without constant disruption. That build-up enabled the subsequent offensive operations that pushed Japanese forces back across the Owen Stanley Mountains and eventually recaptured the north coast of New Guinea. None of this would have been possible if 75 Squadron had continued losing pilots to tip strikes at the rate they were losing them in April 1942. The mathematics were straightforward. At the pre-modification loss rate, the squadron would have been combat ineffective by mid-June. With the wheels, they remained operational through the critical period when Port Moresby was under maximum pressure. The tactical innovation was not the wheels themselves. It was recognizing that pilot survival mattered more than aircraft performance. The Kittyhawk was already inferior to the Zero in most performance categories. Adding drag from wingtip wheels made it slightly more inferior, but if those wheels kept pilots alive, the trade-off was acceptable. This seems obvious in retrospect, but it was not obvious in 1942. Military aviation culture emphasized aircraft performance, pilot skill, and aggressive tactics. The idea of deliberately degrading aircraft performance to improve pilot survival was almost heretical. Jeffrey had to order the modification over the objections of his pilots and ground crew. No one wanted to fly an aircraft with wagon wheels bolted to the wingtips. It looked ridiculous. It felt wrong. But it worked, and that was what mattered. The story of the wingtip wheels became a minor footnote in the history of World War II in the Pacific. It did not change the strategic course of the war. It did not influence major decisions. Most histories of the New Guinea campaign do not mention it at all. But for the pilots of 75 Squadron flying Kittyhawks against superior Japanese aircraft in the desperate spring of 1942, those absurd-looking wheels were the difference between dying in a tip strike or surviving to fight another day. And fighting another day meant shooting down Japanese bombers. And shooting down Japanese bombers meant Port Moresby survived. And Port Moresby surviving meant Australia did not face invasion. Sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that look stupid until they work. The wingtip wheels looked incredibly stupid. Ground crew mocked them. Pilots complained about them. Visiting American officers from 5th Air Force headquarters saw them and asked if the Australians had lost their minds. But between May and July 1942, those stupid wheels contributed to the destruction of 32 Japanese bombers and kept Australian pilots alive during the most critical phase of the New Guinea campaign. That was Wing Commander Jeffrey's genius. He did not try to make the Kittyhawk competitive with the Zero. That was impossible. He did not try to train his pilots to be better than veteran Japanese aviators. That would take years. He just tried to keep his pilots alive long enough to learn, to gain experience, to become effective. The wingtip wheels were a temporary solution to a temporary problem, but they worked during the time period when they were needed. By the time they were removed in September 1942, they had accomplished their purpose. 75 Squadron was still operational. Port Moresby was still in Allied hands. The Japanese advance had been stopped. The wheels were scrapped. Most were thrown into scrap metal piles and eventually melted down for reuse. A few were kept as souvenirs by ground crew. One wheel, removed from Squadron Leader Jackson's aircraft, was mounted on a plaque and hung in the squadron's operations room. It remained there until 1944 when the squadron moved to the Philippines and the wheel was left behind. Its current location is unknown. Probably lost, probably destroyed, probably forgotten by everyone except the handful of men who knew what it represented. After the war, aviation historians occasionally mentioned the wingtip wheels as an example of field improvisation under combat conditions. Some dismissed it as a desperation measure that barely worked. Others praised it as innovative tactical thinking. The truth was probably between those extremes. The wheels were a crude solution to a specific problem. They worked well enough during the time period when they were needed. They were discarded when circumstances changed. That was how war worked. Adapt, survive, move on. John Jackson survived the war. He returned to Australia in 1945 with the rank of Wing Commander. He had flown over 200 combat missions and was credited with 6 confirmed victories and 3 probable. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he worked as a commercial pilot for Qantas until retirement in 1977. He died in 1992 at age 74. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to school groups about his wartime experiences. He always mentioned the wingtip wheels. He would describe how ridiculous they looked, how much the pilots hated them, how everyone thought they were the stupidest modification anyone had ever seen. Then he would pause and tell the students that those stupid wheels saved his life and the lives of his friends and helped Australia survive at a time when survival was not guaranteed. Wing Commander Peter Jeffrey survived the war with the rank of Group Captain. He commanded several operational squadrons and training units. After the war, he remained in the Royal Australian Air Force until retirement in 1961. He rarely spoke publicly about the wingtip wheels. When asked, he would say it was a minor tactical modification that served a temporary purpose. He deflected credit to his pilots and ground crew. He died in 1986 at age 73. His obituary in the Sydney Morning Herald did not mention the wingtip wheels. Sergeant Bill Morrison, the ground crew chief who had installed the wheels on Jackson's aircraft, survived the war and returned to his automotive repair shop in Sydney. He kept one of the wingtip wheels as a souvenir. It sat in his garage for decades, gradually accumulating dust and grease. In 1975, a local museum contacted him about donating wartime memorabilia. Morrison donated the wheel. The museum displayed it for several years in an exhibit about improvisation and adaptation during wartime. Eventually, the exhibit was dismantled and the wheel was moved to storage. It remains there today, catalogue number A, 1975-327, described as aircraft wheel, modified, unknown purpose, circa 1942. The documentation does not explain what it was used for or why it mattered. The 32 Japanese bombers shot down by 75 Squadron between May and July 1942 represented more than just tactical victories. Each bomber carried a crew of 7 men. 32 bombers meant 224 Japanese aircrew killed or missing. Each bomber that did not return to Rabaul was one less aircraft available for subsequent missions. The cumulative effect of those losses forced Japanese commanders to reduce the operational tempo of attacks against Port Moresby. Fewer attacks meant less destruction of Allied infrastructure. Less destruction meant better logistics. Better logistics meant more effective defence. More effective defence meant Port Moresby survived. The causal chain from wingtip wheels to strategic survival was indirect and difficult to quantify, but it existed. Military historians after the war attempted to calculate the impact of various tactical innovations on strategic outcomes. The calculations were necessarily speculative, but several post-war analyses suggested that 75 Squadron's unusual effectiveness during May through July 1942 contributed significantly to Port Moresby's survival during its most vulnerable period. And the squadron's effectiveness during that period was directly enabled by the wingtip wheel modification that kept pilots alive and allowed tactics that would otherwise have been impossible. The story illustrates a broader principle about warfare and innovation. The most effective solutions are often not the most sophisticated or the most elegant. Sometimes the most effective solution is whatever works with available resources under existing constraints. Wing Commander Jeffrey did not have better aircraft. He did not have more pilots. He did not have advanced technology. He had wagon wheels and scrap metal and a maintenance sergeant who could weld. He used what he had to solve the problem he faced. The solution looked stupid because it was stupid by any conventional engineering standard. But it worked, and in war, working is the only standard that matters. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.